All right, thank you for having me here. Today I'm going to be presenting on a section of my dissertation that examines sassafras's cultural history in the Chesapeake colonies. Sassafras shaped English colonization of North America, providing an important resource and commodity. I'm going to be speaking in the past tense oftentimes, but it should be acknowledged that sassafras is still around and that some of the traditions I'm describing are still maintained today, mainly among people living in the eastern United States. Found in open woods, along forest edges and fences and in fields, sassafras is a tree that likes habitat disturbance, including fire. For millennia, indigenous peoples used fire to shape North American landscapes. Fire, whether anthropogenic or not, encouraged the emergence of new saplings. It's also the color this tree turns in the fall. With its strong aroma and polymorphic leaves, sassafras beckons people to it. And that's certainly how early modern period authors described it. This is a plant that has many uses. Indigenous North Americans attributed the smell to ward off evil spirits that carried disease. It's from the saffron oil in the plant that contributes to the virtues and is marked by this fennel or cinnamon-like aroma. Sassafras's more recent history is beyond the scope of this paper, but it's been its use has been regulated by the United States Food and Drug Administration since the 1960s, when scientists found correlation between the consumption of very large amounts of saffron and the presence of cancerous tumors and liver damage. But from saffron, people can create ecstasy, MDA, and other stimulant hallucinogens. Typically, references to sassafras are connected to its medicinal use. It was promoted as a panacea, and it was used to treat a wide variety of ailments. Some I have listed here. And it was most frequently referenced as a stimulating tea that was good for fevers. Different parts of the plant were utilized, but the roots and the areas with the greatest concentration of the saffron oil, those are going to be the most potent components. Okay, so now we're going to venture to the borderlands of 16th century North America. We'll briefly be starting in the Georgia-Florida coast before moving northward. The name sassafras was given by the French, taken from the Latin saxifrage, meaning stone breaking, which is referencing the laborious process of root harvesting. It was aid from a Timucua tribe to ill French Huguenots at Fort Caroline. That was one of the first European engagements with sassafras, and this occurs around 1565. Not only did the Timucua provide the colonists with gifts of food and medicine, but they shared their knowledge regarding how to identify the tree, how to harvest the roots, and then how to prepare the medicinal tea, which French Huguenots found healing. They then passed this information to Spanish soldiers who likewise became faddists. Both the French and Spanish worked to commoditize sassafras as a medicinal drug. And so this is a very oversimplified story, but it includes an astounding amount of violence and grappling for control between French, Spanish, and Indigenous actors. And then here in this image, we have an early European depiction of North America. And this is one that scholar Holly Dugan has pointed as incorporating sassafras in that highlighted portion. I'll have another image to show you in a minute. Eventually, physician Nicholas Menardus heard rumblings about sassafras along the docks of Seville. He managed to obtain a specimen and collected interviews with those freshly returned from the New World. He determined it was a powerful drug, ideal for treating syphilis, rheumatism, and dropsy, among other things. And he found that men often carried it in their pocket in the name of preparation. His publications on North American medicinal drugs legitimized the use of sassafras, which subsequent translations, like the one pictured here by Frampton, intensified European demand. The English are late to the party for colonized North America, but they're also intrigued by this prospect of commoditizing sassafras. In fact, the English used the presence of the tree to help determine appropriate locations for settlement. Aside from its value as a commodity, its presence was believed to indicate an appropriate level of moisture for European bodies. Sir Walter Raleigh held the English royal patent to colonize North America. At Roanoke, which he helped establish, Thomas Harriot reported favorably on the potential of sassafras as a commodity, and the colonists continued to consume it. It even served as a starvation food more than once. John White's watercolors from Roanoke are another instance where Holly Dugan has pointed to visual depictions of sassafras. So the Roanoke colony is ultimately unsuccessful, but other English explorers do return to England with literally tons of sassafras. It's often gathered with assistance from Indigenous men. Um, and so those who do this without Raleigh's approval, he realizes when the market fluctuates and that enrages him, he is working to protect his patent. He's then working to claim compensation and then re-export the roots out of England. So by the time that Jamestown is founded in 1607, it's widely believed that sassafras is going to be a successful commodity. And that's what the first reports in June of 1607 say. The council states that it's the easiest and the richest commodity, and that the sailors that are going to be returning already have 2 tons of sassafras, which is probably going to upset market prices and is something that the Virginia Company is going to need to address. Also, in that process of extracting these roots, the sailors damaged and lost many of the colony's tools. At Jamestown, colonists are fascinated by the natural resources, which includes experimenting with potential materia medica, and they're often using intel and likely labor from the Powhatan and the other Algonquin-speaking tribes that are in the local area. This work is also done out of need. Jamestown is infamously a place with a lot of health issues, are often related to water quality and poor nutrition. Not understood to the colonists was that the region was experiencing a significant period of drought that was connected to the Little Ice Age, which worsened conditions and then contributed to tensions with the Powhatan and other local peoples. Regardless, sassafras and eventually tobacco are the main exports in the 1620s. In 1623, the colony fails to meet demands set by the Virginia Company and they're fined. Some historians have equated this to an issue of scarcity, but it's really more of an issue of access that's related to the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. I agree that colonists are not sustainably harvesting sassafras, but there's more factors at play that have to do with risk and investment. Harvesting tree roots is time-consuming and physically taxing. Having to locate and then harvest the sassafras, that pulls labor away from tobacco cultivation. And it involves then being in a location that is potentially vulnerable, where the Powhatan have the upper hand. And I said earlier that sassafras trees benefit from environmental disruptions. That's true, but the saplings are going to be less desirable. They're going to have smaller roots. And then there's also this issue of plant identification. So the aroma is often used, but there's a variety of trees in this area that have spicy smells that if you've never actually encountered it before, you might have a hard time distinguishing. So tobacco was more reliable and safer than harvesting sassafras. Additionally, the area north of the James River is referred to by the Powhatan as Wyonook, which has been translated to be the land of sassafras. So I don't think that scarcity is really the issue here. Historians often portray sassafras as being eclipsed by tobacco in the 17th century, but I think more so it's being paired with tobacco. The fad for sassafras consumption is still gaining momentum. In 1627, Neander's Sassafrologia is published, and it's reinforcing and even extending Menardus's claims. And really, tobacco is a bandage for Virginia's issues. It hindered colonial economic and cultural development in ways that deeply troubled organizers. And John Farrar, formerly an administrator for the Virginia Company, he was among those who felt that the region's medicinal drugs, including sassafras, were really what could remedy both colonial health and economy. So he puts out a map. This is an adaptation of it, but there's an abundance of plants and animals, and the only thing that's labeled is sassafras. And there's similar looking trees throughout the map, including one that is at a location that is where Maryland's Sassafras River is today. Around the same time, his daughter, named Virginia, she was publishing a treaty on the medicinal virtues of sassafras and tobacco, and she is pointing to poor conditions on ships as being a major contributor to colonial deaths that had been blamed on Virginia's unhealthy environment. Katrina Matham has used London port books to explore English exportation of North American drugs, including sassafras. And so while these port books are incomplete records with limitations, including some missing decades, they do acknowledge incredibly large amounts of sassafras moving through London in the 18th century. And so some of that supply is likely then re-exported to other locations in the effort to maintain market prices. But Matham's findings align with my observations taken from copies of the Virginia Gazette that reference shipments of sassafras between 1737 and 1752. There are later references regarding sassafras, but it's often around the American Revolution, talking about it as an alternative to drinking rich teas. And then it's also listed as a requested medicinal supply for the army. So sassafras is found in apothecary shops and among remedies listed in records like commonplace books, like the one I have pictured here. This particular receipt details a remedy to stop children from eating dirt. It's likely being used as a dewormer. So sassafras was not only accessible, but it was also more in line with Indigenous and West African healing traditions. You have to remember that this is a time when planters are attempting to dictate the health care of their laborers, enslaved and hired. So self-treatment is a form of resistance. And then sassafras, it remains an important resource for Black herbalists today. This was also a period when special knowledge of remedies and plant virtues could grant wealth and authority. In the 18th century, Virginia's colonial government awarded several individuals emancipation or money for their cures. John Tennant is one of these individuals, and he publishes Every Man His Own Doctor, which includes sassafras as an ingredient for a variety of remedies. Later editions have even more sassafras inclusions, but his purpose is to offer simple and accessible remedies that allow colonists to bypass physicians, which there's a massive shortage of in the colonies anyway. Rarely is sassafras the only ingredient to an 18th century remedy. It's more often part of a polyherbal receipt, or it's a tea that's a recommended beverage, or it's a component to a strengthening drink that incorporates alcohol. Observations from Benjamin Latrobe in the 1790s revealed that roadway sassafras trees in Virginia were heavily utilized by travelers, and it really hindered them from ever reaching large sizes. But more revealing is Latrobe's commentary on the hierarchy of cultural medicinal knowledge. Like many, Latrobe preferred what he was familiar with, formal medicine. And he had some respect for Black medicinal practices. He talked to these individuals as informers, but he really placed Indigenous traditions in the middle of this hierarchy. And he rationalized this by saying that it was better authenticated and longer practiced, which made him think it was more worthy of incorporating into popular medicine. So this hierarchy and demand for knowledge, it remains into the 19th and 20th centuries. Elements of it exist today. As healthcare in America is infamously hindered by race and class, some of these traditions have persisted. Ethnography in the 20th century has shed some more light on the applications of sassafras by Black and Indigenous healers. I have a few things listed here. The Rappahannock and Pamunkey are local Chesapeake tribes, and then the records I got from Black healers, I couldn't get it really to a specific location, so it's more general, like American South, than just the Chesapeake. Okay, so now I'm going to change gears just a little, and I'm going to highlight the entanglements between some of the naturalists working in the region and with sassafras. Known for his observations of Virginia was Reverend John Clayton, the rector of Jamestown's parish from 1682 to 1684. He was keenly interested in the natural sciences. He corresponds with the Royal Society, and he offers a lot of really specific observations of the colony and its inhabitants. Many of his remarks are disparaging to both white and Indigenous Virginians, but he describes sassafras as a remarkable herb that's being used by the Indigenous people he encounters. It's also the first medicinal plant that he decides to discuss, and that's a trend that I noticed among many who botanize in the region. So Clayton recounts much about those that he encountered. He speaks of Indigenous reticence to explain their methods or the training of their practitioners. And his work reveals not only that there's this continued sense of colonial entitlement for Indigenous knowledge, but that it's specific to health and local materia medica, but also that there is an element of Indigenous resistance by not engaging. Overlapping with Clayton is John Bannister, another missionary chaplain in Virginia. He's sponsored by Bishop Henry Compton and arrives in 1679. And he's immensely talented. He sends excellent illustrations, descriptions, and preserved plants. He sends his contacts across the Atlantic curiosities that make their way into their gardens and collections and scientific publications. Here's just a few of his contacts. But Bannister does what many in Virginia do to rise socially. He marries a wealthy widow, he becomes a planter, and just a local figure of importance. He dies in 1692 in an accident while collecting. And his death occurs before he finished writing a natural history. So his manuscript is among his belongings that are dealt with by planter and trader William Byrd, who sends some of those materials back to England, but absorbs Bannister's library and takes on responsibility for Bannister's young son. Men like William Byrd and his son William Byrd II, who becomes a Royal Society Fellow at the urging of his father, they are curious about identifying alternate commodities and remedies. In some regards, they function as patrons, but not in the traditional sense. Byrd II repeatedly asked for additional botanists to be sent to Virginia after Bannister's replacements went to Maryland. And then Byrd II and his brother-in-law, Robert Beverley, they both publish on the natural history of the colonies. And they use their status as native-born Virginians and their access to the region to build authority on related matters. And much of Beverley's writings are actually being taken from the unfinished manuscript that was left by John Bannister. Mark Catesby is another naturalist who spent time collecting in Virginia and further south. He had journeyed with his sister's family to the colony. He pretty much immediately meets William Byrd, and they hit it off, becoming friends, going collecting and traveling. And Catesby instructs Byrd on how to make his garden more fashionable. Later, he goes on to publish his natural history, and then the Hortus Europa Americanus is published posthumously. But in both publications, he references sassafras's use in Virginia to treat fevers. Catesby's interests also lie in identifying which plants will do well in England, and he's collaborating not just with naturalists, but with London nurserymen. Familiar to both Catesby and Byrd II was Peter Collinson, one of the most conscientious encouragers of American science in the 18th century. And his passion was for cultivating exotic plants in England, and he's quite partial to raising American species. From his correspondence with John Custis IV, we know that Collinson successfully raised a sassafras tree in his garden. Custis is another wealthy planter. He's living in Virginia and Williamsburg, and he is also a brother-in-law to William Byrd II. Everyone is related if you're in the same social class, is what I found. But yeah, so he sends Collinson more seeds after a cold spell damages his tree. And Custis comments on the irony of the situation since sassafras is one of the hardiest plants in Virginia. And it's actually from Custis's garden that we have the only archaeological evidence of sassafras that I've been able to identify. It's often not it's not entirely surprising because given preservation conditions for the region, it's not favorable that roots or leaves are going to preserve. But still, it's a little bit remarkable. Okay, moving on to John Clayton, and this is another John Clayton, not the Reverend, but John Clayton, the botanist, as he's known. He is an English-born planter and a county clerk in Gloucester County, Virginia. He sends Mark Catesby just too many specimens, which Catesby then forwards on to Gronovius, who then Clayton collaborates with, and Gronovius publishes the Flora Virginica. But Clayton is in contact with Collinson, Bartram, Linnaeus, the same network. And Clayton attempts to publish an updated manuscript in the 1760s, but the second version of Flora Virginica is published first by Gronovius' son. Frustratingly, Clayton's papers, including that unpublished manuscript, burn after they are placed somewhere for safekeeping. But interestingly, it is known that Clayton offered compensation to people to bring him plants that he had never encountered. And then Clayton's neighbor, John Mitchell, he's today known for his influential map of North America, here, the Mitchell map. And he is a Virginian physician that was educated in Edinburgh. He has a wide variety of interests from possums, pigmentation, to yellow fever, but his first love was really botany and medicinal botany at that. And he is also sending plants across the Atlantic to all his contacts, including a former professor, Charles Olston. And one of those plants that he sent Alston was sassafras. He said, this is the one you find in the shops. And ideally, it would be nice if you could do some sort of chemical analysis on it. I don't know how to do that, although we know later on that Mitchell does try to open up a lab. Doesn't seem to be very successful. And then a few years later, Mitchell leaves Virginia to improve his health. He loses much of his collection and his belongings to pirates. But after relocating to London, he writes a manuscript on North American medicinal plants. And it's a similar story where it's never published and it's unfortunately lost. So all these naturalists, they complain about having too much to do. Many of them suffer poor health, which hinders their collecting activities. And in some cases, there's accounts of them having assistance from children or neighbors. Many wanted to procure indentured or enslaved labor. And then there's murkier records where men requested help in procuring slaves. This is the case for Catesby. And then there's some like Mitchell who were born into slaveholding families. So these curious gentlemen, they're interested in indigenous, Black, and folk plant use, especially regarding medicinal applications. Even if they didn't feel it was scientifically grounded or hold their informants in high regard, they desired access to this expertise. So there's multiple levels of power imbalance at play. It's really not surprising that colonists published anonymously, that they struggled to publish, and that they were minimally acknowledged. It's also not surprising that the naturalists working in the region would source labor and insight while they made minimal acknowledgments. Regardless to status and narrative making, this process of knowledge making, really knowledge reporting, was collaborative. Sassafras embodied the power of North America's wilderness. It stimulated both bodies and economies, and it was something gleaned from the woods that many desperately wanted in their gardens, even after the limits of sassafras's virtues were realized. All right. Thank you for having me. Thank you to these organizations, thank you to the organizers. My email's here, and I recommend feedback, questions to my email.